Welcome, everybody, to the Revenue Problem Solvers podcast, where we crack the code on growing your business by tackling the challenges that keep revenue leaders up at night. I'm Carl Ortmans, and on today's episode, we're going to dive into a bit of a fun topic, the topic of launching a spin-out product from your company. Today's podcast is sponsored by Virtual Causeway. Virtual Causeway is a B2B go-to-market partner who helps you generate more qualified leads, speed up your sales cycle, and grow revenue without adding headcount. Learn more about them at virtualcauseway.com and mention the show for a special rate. Before we jump in, here's why the conversation matters. Imagine implementing just one strategy from today's conversation and watching your revenue metrics shift within weeks, not months. That's exactly what the goal of the podcast is. Let's talk about the revenue challenge that others have faced and how they've solved it. As I like to say, success leaves clues, and we're going to highlight those for clues for you today. So now with me today is to talk about this topic is Glenn Schmelzle. So Glenn and I met through a local leadership network a few years back, and we've had some really great discussions and debates. And I knew he was somebody that we had to have on us. So Glenn is a go-to-market leader, and he may describe himself as a marketing analytics innovator as well. He's held marketing and sales leadership roles from companies like Actuate, Distill Interactive, Momenta Systems, and he's also a professor with Lambton College, Algonquin College, and the University of Ottawa. On top of all of that, he's also the host of the Funnel Reboot podcast. Glenn, welcome to the Revenue Problem Solvers podcast, and thank you for joining us.
Carl, I am delighted to be here and for us to chew into this meaty topic.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. So let's solve some revenue problems, shall we? So let's kick off. Let's kick us off. Let's ask you a little bit about you and your world. What industries, verticals do you work in? What are your selling motions? What size companies do you work with?
Yeah, so the size has been all over the place, but the different kind of verticals range from, let's say, technology based. So enterprise software, hardware, and even those that are used in highly regulated places, such as hardware for medical use or software used in a hospital or secondary or tertiary healthcare institution. So I've worked in places where there's a lot riding on things having to go right and where it's not as simple a sale as I like it, ship me 10.
Mm-hmm. Well, I like it. Ship me 10 is a world that I think many of us would love to be in. So very cool. Okay. So how we got to this topic today, for everybody listening in, I asked Glenn, I said, what's a successful revenue initiative you've led or an existing challenge that you have solved or are solving? And it was kind of a back and forth. And you kind of quickly jumped at this topic to say, it's the revenue mistakes companies make when they're trying to spin out a new brand. So the obvious to me elephant in the room question is how come this is such a challenge for companies to solve?
Yeah, maybe if I could come right out and say what I think will be the theme, it's the DNA.
Oh,
If you're an established enterprise, you and I both know this because we've both worked in these kind of places. There is a inertia at play, and it has gotten really good. Uh, in order to grow and sustain itself, the organization has solved for customers, solved for distribution, solved for how it hires and the type of people that fit in its culture, the alignment between marketing and sales, and then sales and service. It's kind of got many of those things, and if it's profitable, then it has been able to use money to keep that whole engine lubricated and going. um, Wonderful. But I'm pointing to several points in my career where I've been at places that said what we need is a new product or a new brand, and we want to try and use the resources that we have inside of our existing enterprise to nourish and grow and maybe spin out that thing, or maybe to have it be become our next revenue engine, right? The next gen, when our legacy way of doing things is old hat.
Mhm.
And it's a wonderful idea, but I think a boatload of challenges come into play when you try to do it. So I hope we can talk about that here.
Yeah, so that's maybe the question that's top of mind, like, on the tip of my tongue, maybe top of mind, whatever you want to say. So, I guess in your experience, how come the companies haven't just maintained to say, we're either a branded house or a house of brands, whichever way you want to look at it.
Yes.
How come they're not thinking about it of like, "Hey, we're a branded house, everything is gonna be on it," or, "You know what? We're gonna be a house of brands, we're gonna maintain that main company, but each is gonna have his own brand, but it's all gonna work the same motions, etcetera." So, is it a house of brands problem? Is it a branded house problem? Or is it a we know better, neither of them work?
Yeah, I'm going to say neither of them because
Okay.
back to DNA, if it's a house of brands, you might be doing things slightly differently. But if you're accounting, your AR and AP function, or the way that the SDR hands things to an account executive, and then it gets into, ordering and fulfillment or quotation, if you're in a house of brands scenario and these are just really different SKUs that go through the same meat grinder process,
Mhm.
um, that to me is still enterprise. When I'm talking about an innovative new product or new way of doing things, I'm talking about something completely disruptive, something that maybe you had to create a skunk works for. And I want
Mhm.
to pause there for a second in case people aren't familiar with what I mean by skunk works. It's a phrase that comes from the aeronautics field. And not sure what the skunk has to do with it, but I can guess that in big companies, particularly US civilian aircraft and military aircraft manufacturers, what they found was that they could get really good at building things in mass production mode, right? We're going back to like the 1940s, 50s, 60s when, the great American power plant of, mass production was in full force. And that, however, was not what was going to get them the next wave. When, let's say, NASA came calling and said, hey, President Kennedy has said he wants us to get to the moon, or we've been told that we need to build a machine that travels faster than the speed of sound. Can you do that for us? Those enterprises found that they were utterly incapable of doing it with their existing setup. So what they would sometimes do is look around on their, facility grounds, and across the other side of the tarmac there might be an old shed, and they would send a small group of people out to that far area, call it a skunk works. I'm imagining because maybe like a skunk, you want to be far away from it. It smells. And on their own, those people, a very small team, what Jeff Bezos supposedly said, you know, would be you could feed this group with two pizzas, right? The two pizza rule. That these small teams might be what germinate out your next great product idea.
Mm.
And if you can do that and they can act that way, and we can start to build out their customer acquisition function, their production function, their fulfillment and finance and all the rest of it functions, then there's something that maybe has tremendous value. And maybe the parent company at that point can capture that value or sell it off or, you know, produce new things and actually learn how to do this as a repeatable cycle.
Mhm.
So that's the promise of doing spinouts. And it is a very noble idea. And I think that kind of idea of building it off a side, that's the way you do it. And things like how does it fit into our brand, that comes much later after you've maybe talked to customers and the customers have said, I really like that product, but you better not associate it with like what your major brand is, because I would never think to come to your company for that kind of product or service.
Mhm. Yeah, it. The question, it makes sense, but I guess where I'll go is I've heard of it recently said from actually some of the folks like we know. I'll give him a shout out, Gary Amaral. Like Gary talks a lot about like, oh, that's the side of my desk project. I'm working on
Yes,
something over there. From your experience, is there a point where companies either see traction inside of a product and say this has to be its own thing, or do you see it, or have you seen the experience of we just think that this has its own brand reputation that we want to separate it on its own versus having it as like an additional offering of that branded house? Like how have you seen that?
I've seen all different motivations, and I
Okay.
don't think that one is right or one is wrong. But I do think that you have to treat how that brand is functioning, including the revenue function, and you have to sift through the problems that you're going to have when you're doing it on its own. You got to tackle those head on earlier rather than later. So let's take one really simple example. Let's say I've got a well-established sales force for my enterprise product.
Mhm.
Do I imagine that after I've built a few prototypes and I've got, something that has wires hanging out of it and, you know, unsanded edges on it, so to speak, and I want to try to find some customers for it. Am I being rational if I expect that my existing seasoned and high velocity salespeople who are selling something that they can do with their eyes closed, that they will at all be the right people to tackle selling this new prototype and getting a memorandum of understanding or a commitment to be involved in future research as one needs to do with innovations? I don't think so. I think they're the last people in the world you would ever want to. And you may, from a brand standpoint, want to keep them completely detached. If that's true, then how are you going to sell this thing? Are you going to ask an engineer to try and sell it? I don't think that's the right thing either.
So where have you seen it go? Maybe because we talked about the challenges, but where does it go well? And I say that because I've
Yep.
been part of companies where have launched an entire brand, but they're actually looking at it as like it's a whole new product. We actually hired a whole new team. Said, hey, look, this is a new product. It's a new team. It's a new focus area. We're going to keep you in that. I don't want to say Delta Squad, but that seems to be a term that consistently comes up. Here's the Delta Squad that we are going to launch with this, and we're going to prove it out, yes or no. Have you seen that approach work? Is that the one that you would suggest to some, or are they just so enamored with, well, our reps are doing super well. We're going to give them another product or SKU to sell. They'll figure it out.
I have seen it work, but the the wheels can still come off the bus even if you set up those initial conditions properly. So I'm going to suggest that we also use a gated approach for it. So let's imagine that the enterprise, like the board, tossed in some money to get this thing rolling.
Mhm.
So gates are already there. We don't have to imagine that they're going to be that we have to artificially put them in. But the board's gates might not be the only gates that we want. Their gates are going to be, hey, we're going to let this go for 12, 24, maybe 36 months. Uh, we've given them runway for it. By that time, we expect minimum viable product, proof of product market fit, and proof of how some of your basic sales metrics stand, what our customer cost of acquisition is, a rough sense of how large an average order value is. Okay, those sorts of things. Okay, that's great. But there are some other things that we need to pose for that entity to see whether or not those are even realistic end destinations. What if it goes along starting to think of itself as being something that can work within the company and the company can use all those metrics? But then we realize it has to use some outside IP, or it actually, we noticed as we were testing with early customers that the customers that this thing can sell to have zero overlap with our existing customer base.
Mm-hmm.
Wait a minute. So now is the board an investor in a entity, or is the board looking at this like a future product line and measuring it the same way it measures other product lines? So those are the gates I'm looking at. Like, maybe there's a, what does it look like when we have to pivot gate? Or does it seem to be ready to go into a period of trying to separate itself from those things that the mothership, right, that the parent company was nourishing it with?
Mm.
Because maybe we've got, some uh, talent, some technical talent that is, sometimes being seconded over there, and they're helping them. Okay, is it fair to say that this entity can stand on its own when it's been drawing on very expensive resources that happen to work full time for the parent company? Have we tracked those dollars and said, well, if we had to pay market rates for that same brain power, but this thing were out on its own, would we still have profitability?
Mm.
Right. And then I guess the last one that I'm very keen on, because we're here in a sales discussion, is, does that entity have gates in it where we're measuring to see if the individual functions are standing up on their own feet? So the simplest example I can give you is, I've recently worked with a group that was uh, very established, but had a baby company which they were trying to nurture. And what the baby company was built with was, it had a fractional marketer, a fractional salesperson, and a full time, let's call them a service engineer, a person who actually fulfilled and made the technology deployable. What we happened to notice was, the service engineer, because the marketing and sales were so fractional, the service engineer would go and find prospects, and they would figure out through their ingenuity how this product could be used in those far-flung prospect scenarios. And these were prospects that, like, had nothing to do with each other. um, the problem was that what they were doing kind of backed up into what sales should have been doing, right?
Mm.
Qualifying, noticing ideal client profiles, figuring out different sources for how those prospect groups should be found. And then that backed up into marketing of, who are we going after? What is our value to those groups? How would we be seen and position ourselves as the solution for them? And it became a royal mess. Uh, and it wasn't anyone's fault, but it was, we didn't have enough of the right resources at the right times that were running the funnel the way the funnel should run. So it went backwards.
Do you think that there's the problem statement? It seems like to me is, when you start to get and you start to grow, and you become an established brand and you grow, when you start to go into different phases of scale and etc., you hire different skill sets. The marketer or the salesperson, as an example, at a startup that's just starting, is very different than at a company where you're at 150 or 200 people. You're not a growth marketer that you would be sort of in that early stage. You might be a little bit different when you get into that scale. Is the problem, is there a problem maybe from reevaluating the talent? Is that maybe something that people have to consider, of when you're looking, if you want to do this, an enterprise level rep who has only ever sold established brand recognized solutions
Yep.
is going to struggle and I've seen it many times, is going to struggle if you give them a product of not a lot of market fit. They're trying to figure it out, and they have to effectively figure that out. Is that where there's the root cause of this first thing of like, look, the skill set of the people you want to do a thing is not the people you have on your team, and that's one of the leading that's the underlying issue for this problem to start.
You've beautifully outlined a symptom of that folly I was talking about at the start when I said we should be very careful that we don't imagine that things that are available within the enterprise will be of help to this fledgling
Mm,
spin out. As a matter of fact, they can do damage. Um, if that enterprise person, I mean, first off, I think they'll probably look at the onesies and twosies that the new co is selling and hear that they want to get to 10 or maybe dozens of customers. And they may say to themselves, I don't even consider that scale. I mean, for me, scale is tens of thousands to millions.
mhm,
And yet, there are people out there, probably not working for an enterprise, but there are people who are experts in getting from onesies and twosies to tens.
mhm.
That's the kind of people that it's going to need. And we also have to wrap compensation in here. Why will they want to work in a highly volatile startup environment when there's just a like we can either make that startup stand on its own 2 feet and only pay them out of the modest uh, capital that it has, which means they're going to have to take a haircut, compared to market rate. Because I don't see us being able to do things like offer them stock in the parent company because they don't work for the parent company. If they start to work for the parent company, they're going to get infected with that megacorp mindset, and they might start to say, well, we don't need to get this product shipped this week. We
Mhm,
can next month. And that little inflection point there can start to be the death of a thousand cuts for that startup. It will never get to the spin out because we don't have that fierce urgency. I mean, you and I both heard stories from startups where it's down to the wire. They must ship or they
mhm,
must win this next customer. It's that or nothing.
mhm.
And it's very hard to get that culture when you're right beside a large place where they know if they mail it in for a few weeks, the big board numbers aren't going to change.
Mm. Yeah, what it's what it makes me go to is you have to define exactly the type of group of people you're going to look for. And so it sounds like the skill sets. And maybe there's the question to ask you is in those early selling days of a new product. So I don't know, I have an innovative new cup. We'll just use that as an example. I have an
Sure.
innovative new cup that I want to launch, and it's so much different than what my software product is. But I fully believe that this new innovative cup that I have a software connection to is going to change the market and the way that people hydrate themselves. It's
Sure.
totally different. So the question that I have is who does the selling, the market research, the product research? And how is that where's the success? Is it hire a brand new team or poach people from inside to train them on how to do this new thing? Do you start over? What's the clue on, hey, look, I've seen the problem statements from the persona or the personnel side, I should say, of where this went wrong, and here's how to correct it. How would you advise somebody on creating that spin out to start just from the personnel side before even talking about all the systems? But what's the personnel side? Who starts the selling? And then at what point is it like, okay, now we got to bring more people in?
Yeah. Great question. Startups to me, they first and foremost need people who have that DNA of, scrappy startup. But beyond that, the ones who usually do well are generalists. So you've got a person who could make the cup or is familiar with the cup's production process, but they're also familiar with selling and maybe they understand some marketing fundamentals. So you're going to give that person maybe a job where they have to do sales, but they're highly adjacent to marketing and highly adjacent to the actual product person. I don't know if that's the kind of person that back in the mothership, the corporate HR team selected for. I would wager if they were filling a 30-person sales force and a 10-person marketing group, they were probably looking at specialized people within one minute function and probably people who had long-term vertical industry experience. And that is the problem. I mean, they're very specialized. So if you grab them and you put them in the startup environment, they'll be like, whoa, 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 I don't do that.
Mm-hmm.
But then the other side is if they've gone to every trade show and been part of the professional association and the whole 9 yards with the specialty of that vertical, sitting over in the startup where you're trying to quote Apple, think different, they're probably going to put up a little resistance when you say, well, why do we do it that way? They're going to feel a little bit of that. Clayton Christensen calls this the innovator's dilemma. They're going to be like, they're going to get defensive. Like, well, why are you challenging that? We've always done it that way.
Mm-hmm.
And right. And so when you're moving people across, that's one thing. But I'm going to say, even if we do hire all startup type people, Delta Squad, we're not done. We have to think about leadership. And we have to think about those dotted line reports over to the central group,
Mm-hmm.
wherever we're reporting up through to. Um, I think we have to consider that we have a CFO somewhere who is going to be holding this small entity to certain metrics. And we have to think through how well at different stages we're going to convince that CFO that we have earned the right to continue existing,
Mm-hmm.
even if we're not yet at profitability. These are, we were just talking before we came on about Eric Reek's Lean Startup,
Mm-hmm.
right? That book is an amazing run through of how do you run a company before the company is making money? And how do you say that you are onto something versus just deluding yourself into thinking that when you're actually dead and you just don't know it.
Mm-hmm.
So we have financial masters that we must please, and we have to think about how we can build long-term value, which may not be expressed in the same metrics that we're always used to using, especially the ones that enterprises are used to using for measuring revenue.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting point here is you're effectively creating an incubator inside of a well-funded company. And so you're giving them, I don't want to say padded walls, but you're giving them a playground to play inside. And I do think what I'm hearing, and this is my opinion, going back even to my conversation with Corey Bray, is think about the skill sets of the people you need to do the work at that time. It's likely going to be different than the people that are doing the work at the mothership and the incubator side, because my experience was joining early startups is those first 50 people believe what you believe. It's a
Yep.
visionary sell. They believe what you believe. The next 50 are like, I think you're onto something. And I want to be part. Once you get to the 100th employee, it's like, I don't, I don't really care about the vision. I want to make the money because I see the traction. And so if we make that separation now from, okay, we've sort of talked a bit about the team and the personnel and the skill sets required, when's the right stage, or what are the right things that people should be thinking about if somebody's listening to now and going, you know what,
Yeah.
I've got this innovative cup mentality,
Yep.
thought process, I want to
Yep.
do it the right way. Where do they start? What are the first couple of things for them to consider?
So I think they have to have a long-term game plan,
Okay.
multi-year game plan. I'm going to start off as this, Maybe it's a pitch to the board and they're really just betting on the talent. That's fine. You can get to skunkworks from there. But then you need to think through, if I'm going to get into a place where we say, let's call from this point on the point where we're truly measuring our ability to separate from the mothership. And how will we, take some of those things that we got a little bit of a crutch or a head start from the enterprise on? How will we be able to really make those our own and show that we could do it without? And then finally, the standalone stage. And I think it's really important to kind of go all the way to the end and
Mhm.
have that end in mind when you're at the beginning. And the end should look like, you know, we have something that we have been able to activate a whole new marketplace that was never going to be touched by our legacy group. Or we have been able to unlock millions, maybe even more of value because we can be um, maybe partly sold, or maybe we can have an IPO and the enterprise that invested from us can get their liquidity event, right? And recapture some of that investment at a high multiple. Or maybe what we can do is we can be this new entity that is a great expert in a field, and we can show how this process can be done again and again. We've kind of made it to the end of that incubator, to
Mhm.
use your phrase, but we also, in the process, helped the mothership understand how to do incubation.
Hmm.
So, like, there's a whole lot of great payoffs, and I think you need to pick one or
Hmm.
two. I don't think you can take them all on, but if we have that mentality, I think we can have a much better outcomes. They say that 96% of all businesses in an economy, in a first world economy like Canada's, are under 100, sometimes even sub 50 employee companies.
Mhm.
Well, wonderful that we have first time entrepreneurs who are willing to sometimes put their own personal finances at risk to be able to start those. But I look at the larger entities and I say to them, if you want, if you're not happy with the returns you're getting at your current valuation and revenues with your legacy products or services, why can't you get into the game? You
Mhm.
seem to know a lot about how to run a business. Why don't you also embrace that lean, mean startup mentality? And how do you do that? You got to think about how to do that without kind of pulling yourself in and drowning in the process. But how can you rationally help catalyze new innovations in businesses and things that help our communities
Mhm.
with following this process? To me, there has to be a solution out there. I don't think we should just stick our heads in the sand and say, it's too hard a problem, I don't want to deal with it.
Mhm.
I think it's something that we should be looking at more and more. I just want us to go in with all aspects of it with our eyes open.
Yeah, if I'm sort of taking a inventory of all the things you said today, and it's make sure you have the right team to do the outcome to start. There's the first thing, because the skill sets are going to drive the outcomes. Having a long term play is important. Then the other thing that sort of come up as I'm curious on is, do you separate the environments from a sales, marketing, revenue operations perspective? Do you give them a new sandbox effectively to play in? So HubSpot, Salesforce, whatever the CRM is an example, or marketing. Do you say, look, I want you to use these other tools to start? Or do you say, you know what? You're gonna have access to the database, but I want you to manage everything in like a Google Sheet or an Excel doc. What would be your best suggestion for those people?
Okay, so we're going under the scenario that this new co is selling back into the customer base
Yeah.
of the existing contacts.
Well, it could be there, or it could be, it's a product adjacent, but we have a database of people that we
Yep.
can probably call to. Are they customers of ours? Maybe not every single person inside of your CRM or your marketing automation is a customer of yours, but they were leads at some point, and there's maybe some gold inside of there because it's easier to go, well, I can just pull a list quickly versus going to a Zoom Info
Yep.
or an Apollo. So
Okay.
I get the question is like, do you start with that lean mentality of, look, just do everything in a spreadsheet, we're going to test it out, and then we'll define the systems? Or do you say play inside the systems that we already have, and then but we'll carve it out for you with new systems and processes and records and fields and etc.
Oh, I'm so glad you asked. Um, Form follows function. So let's say that what you're really concerned about, and we will stick with the example of you're selling into the base. What you're really concerned about is that um, you don't get one of your biggest customers calling their main rep and it coming as news to that rep that someone who says they're from a tiny offshoot of the megacorp is calling them and asking them if they're going to take a trial of something, and that this sales rep from the big corp flies off the handle and says, what, how dare you touch my client. So account based you know approaches, they work, and they normally fit inside of a CRM to do that. So if that's most important in your case, you go with something like that. The condition I'm going to put on it, the qualifier, is be very careful if you're starting to take on that IT stack when you're in the new co, that you're not also burdening the new co with all of that institutional cruft, the security policies that your IT people have on your laptops, the mandate to say, well, we're an Office 365 or a Google Workspace shop. You can't use the other one.
Hmm.
And I'm going to give you a real world example. When Microsoft in Seattle was trying to get someone to see how well some Microsoft applications could run on a Linux based environment, I heard this, that the person who was asked to head up that division, who needed to have an outside internet line to be able to do this because he was hitting firewalls within the Microsoft network that were preventing him from putting a Linux OS on something and have it contacting, let's say, an outside server. He literally had to come in on a weekend with a masonry drill and tunnel a hole through some masonry to run a line to a non Microsoft internet source so that he could run his Linux box. This is what I mean by the insane kind of stuff that we don't realize is there until we are asking someone, well, just do something quick and fast. But meanwhile, we have our decades worth of, sacred network architecture, our marketing and sales stack, all of it. We've worked very hard to build that. And now we're asking them to strain under the burden of that and get their new thing off the ground. So this is why I'm noting a strong note of caution.
Yeah. It goes back to the skill set. How many people would be so willing to do that thing of like, I need to solve the problem, I'll do the thing of drilling through to try to get this connection line so that but yeah, infrastructure is important. Okay, so let's try to get you wrapped up. I know we're getting long in the tooth here, and I know you. I don't want to take too much of your day. So for people that are, I like to say everybody likes new, nobody likes different, and when you do both at the same time, it can cause friction or uncertainty. And so for companies thinking about, hey, I want to spin out a new brand, or I want to separate, or I want to do, I want to put together two different brands and try to sell a separate product. What are the two or three actionable things that they can think about Monday morning to say, hey, if I'm going to do this thing, consider X, Y, and Z, or one, two, three, ABC, whatever you want to say? What are those couple of things that they can consider so that they can be successful?
Sure. I would say you need to hold together in your mind at the same time the different legs of the journey that this thing is going to have. So let's imagine that you do want to stick with this thing until it is fully spun out, or where it has become the way that your institution now works and you no longer do things the old, legacy way that is currently paying the bills. You need to be able to set it up so that it can run in that early stage. What do we have our hands what do we have on our hands here?
Mhm.
Is there something to this? Forgetting that it's maybe got investment value. And then do we have something that could separate from us? Because that's a stage. And then do we have something that could pay us back or bring us the end benefit that we began this whole process for? And my point in kind of laying it out like a relay race is, until all of those legs of the journey are done, you could still end up with nothing. And I want to end on an upbeat note. So, what I'm saying is, think ahead and try to envisage what each leg of that relay race can be like, or how you will work with your leadership, how you will find those maybe misfits within your current organization. And you say, we may have a spot for you over there. Like, think about all those things now so that you can have the best odds possible of being able to achieve that payoff that should be coming at the end.
I really like the analogy of a relay race because as you think of a relay, like even think of the Olympics. When you run a 4x100 meter race, as an example, different people are going to have different skill sets at different times. So the starter has to be there. There's going to be a
Right.
starter who runs the corner the best, who's the straightaway runner to really take us home. And those gates, as you think about, taking it from incubation into delivery, as an example, is an interesting one. So anyways, Glenn, thank you very much for this. Let's wrap up and if anybody wants to talk to you or say, hey, you know what, Glenn, you hit something on the nail on the head. Where could people find you to maybe talk to you a little bit more? What's the best place?
Thanks. Really appreciate that. Well, like you do, Carl, I can't help but just share some of this stuff out on, the digital highways and byways through a podcast. So I would encourage them to check out Funnel Reboot, which is my podcast for sales and marketing things for analytically minded people.
Hmm.
And you also are able to reach out to me on LinkedIn, and you can reach out to me on some other social networks, Instagram and X. If you're looking for myself, it's Glenn Schmelzle or Hey Glenn S.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for this. So, and that wraps up another episode of the Revenue Problem Solvers podcast. I want to thank Glenn for sharing these awesome insights today, strategies that you can effectively put into motion on Monday or right away. If you found value in today's conversation, please like and subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen so you never miss an episode. If you do have feedback, though, I'm all for it. If you say, hey, I think you can be better here, or you got a topic, or you want to be a guest, let me know. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you for investing your time with us today. Remember, success leaves clues, and every revenue problem has a solution. Sometimes you just need the right conversation to find it. Until next time, it's Carl with the Revenue Problem Solvers, helping you turn obstacles into opportunities. Thank you for being with us today.